I think it would be accurate to say that in recent years, our nation has become deeply divided. Now, I understand that politics are politics. There's always been name calling and choosing up sides, gridlock in Congress, all that stuff. But it just seems different now. It's worked its way out of Washington, D.C., and now it's dividing our communities. It's dividing our families. It's dividing our churches. It's common now to see people yelling at each other in school board meetings or calling each other names on the radio and in social media. People no longer trust anyone who has a different perspective. People are increasingly socializing only with people they agree with. This division is not insignificant. It's devastating people's lives and relationships. As just one small sampling of how this is affecting us, I saw a poll recently that said of preachers who are considering quitting ministry, 38% of them say it's because of the current political division. Now, I'll leave it to others to address the question, how did we get so divided? But instead, I want us to focus on the more important question, and that is, how do we change things? Because unless something significant changes, things are only going to get worse. And so we're left with the question, what do we do? And it's important for us to see that the question is not, what should they do? The question is, what should we do? And so today, we're going to try to find the answer to that question as we continue to take a look at the life of King David. We've been working our way through 2 Samuel, and last week in chapter 18, we saw that Absalom led this revolt against King David, his father. There was a war between Absalom's army and David's army, and 20,000 soldiers died. More importantly, Absalom himself was killed in battle. David was absolutely devastated, as any father would be over the death of his son, and he was just about inconsolable. But in chapter 19, our story turns, and David now has this huge task of trying to reunite the nation of Israel and bring everyone together. Even though Israel was one nation, there were a lot of different factions. For starters, there were the people who fought with Absalom and the people who fought with David. And then on top of that, there were two other groups that didn't get along with each other. There were the people of Judah in the south, and then there were the tribes of Israel up in the north. And those people in the north were trying to figure out what they should do. When Absalom started his rebellion, most of them followed Absalom, and they fought for him. But now Absalom is dead, and so what should they do? Should they go back to following David, or should they find somebody else to be their king? Verse 9 reads, throughout all the tribes of Israel, there was much discussion and argument going on. The people were saying, the king, and they're talking about David here, the king rescued us from our enemies and saved us from the Philistines, but Absalom chased him out of the country. Now Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, is dead. Why not ask David to come back and be our king? And so there was a lot of disagreement among the people of Israel. Some of them probably said, we had David as our king before, and we weren't completely happy with him. But the others said, yeah, I know, but you have to admit that David did a lot of good things for us. He defeated all our enemies. And there's really not a better choice at this point. Let's just go ahead and tell David we want him to be our king again. And that's what they did. And then David turned to the tribe of Judah, and he sent a message to the elders there. He said, why are you the last ones to welcome back the king into his palace? For I have heard that all Israel is ready. You are my relatives, my own tribe, my own flesh and blood. So why are you the last ones to welcome back the king? The tribe of Judah is where David was born. A lot of David's relatives were there. And so David says, hey, you're my family. Why haven't you invited me to be king like everyone else has? Well, my guess is that Judah was hesitant to welcome David back because they had also fought on Absalom's side. And if David regains the power, he might punish all of them. And that was a legitimate concern. which may have been the reason that David made a significant leadership decision. David told Amasa that he was going to appoint him as commander over his armies. Now, to understand the significance of that, I need to explain a couple of things. Two of David's commanders were Joab and Abishai. They were brothers. Amasa was their cousin, and all three of them were David's nephews. When Absalom started his rebellion, Joab and Abishai stayed with David. But Amasa, their cousin, went over to Absalom's side, and he was the commander for Absalom's armies. And so now David says to Amasa, I'm going to demote Joab, and I want to put you in charge of my armies. Now, I think there were probably a couple of reasons David did that. At this point in the story, I think David knew that Joab was the one responsible for putting his son Absalom to death. And so this may be David's way of punishing Joab. I mean, there's been this long tension between these two, and maybe David's just tired of it, and so he demotes him. But it's also possible that this was a good political move. Israel and Judah, they're all afraid. I mean, what's David going to do? Is he going to take vengeance on all of them because they joined up with Absalom? And so David takes Amasa and puts him over his troops. And that sends a message to everybody that says, I have no intention of punishing those of you who fought with Absalom. We just need to come back together and be one nation again. And so now it's time for David to go back to Jerusalem and to pick up the pieces. Remember, when David was running away, he crossed the Jordan River headed east. And now he crosses back over the river, and over 1,000 people join him. And basically, they form an escort, a parade, if you will, a celebration that will take them the 20 miles back to Jerusalem, where they can reinstall David as king. Now, what's interesting to me is that back in chapters 16 and 17, the narrator tells us about several people that David encountered on his way out of Jerusalem. And now, as David is going back to Jerusalem, he's going to encounter the exact same people on his way. The first person that he meets is Shimei. Remember that Shimei was the guy who chased after David, threw rocks at him, cursed him, and accused him of killing King Saul. And when he did that, Abishai said, let me go up there and cut off his head. But David said, oh no, just leave him alone. And they went on their way. So imagine you're Shimei. Absalom is now dead, and David is coming back to be reinstalled as the king. After what you did to David and what you said to him, you've got to be thinking, man, I am in so much trouble. Verse 18, as the king was about to cross the river, Shimei fell down before him. My lord, the king, please forgive me, he pleaded. Forget the terrible things your servant did when you left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. I know how much I sinned. That's why I've come here today, the very first person in all of Israel to greet my lord the king. David, I don't know if you remember me or not. I'm that guy who threw rocks at you and who cussed you out. I just want you to know that I am so sorry for what I did. Please forgive me. But before David can say anything, Abishai speaks up in typical fashion. Shimei should die, for he cursed the Lord's anointed. And once again, he wants to kill this guy. Abishai had a quick temper, and it seems like he was always ready for a fight. He was just like his brother Joab. Well, David said, who asked your opinion, you sons of Zeruiah? This is not a day for execution, for today I am once again the king of Israel. David said, what's the problem with you two guys? You always want to start fights. And so David made it known that there'll be no fighting today. He's not going to kill Shimei. And he has mercy on him, and he moves on. And you can only imagine how much conflict and fear would have resulted if David had allowed Abishai to kill Shimei. David was on a mission, and that mission was to pull this nation back together as one again. And killing Shimei would not help that at all. Well, the next person that David runs into and talks to is Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of King Saul, and you remember he was crippled. Back when David left Jerusalem, you remember that Mephibosheth's servant Ziba gave David donkeys and food and provisions for him and his family. And when David asked Ziba where Mephibosheth was, Ziba said that Mephibosheth had betrayed him, that he'd stayed in Jerusalem, that he was trying to use the political unrest to put the family of Saul back on the throne. And so now, while David is on his way back to Jerusalem, Mephibosheth shows up. Now Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, came down from Jerusalem to meet the king. "Why didn't you come with me, Mephibosheth?" the king asked him. Mephibosheth replied, "My lord the king, my servant Ziba deceived me. I told him, 'Saddle my donkey so I can go with the king, for as you know, I am crippled. Ziba has slandered me by saying that I refuse to come. But I know that my lord the king is like an angel of God, so do what you think is best. All my relatives and I could expect only death from you, my lord, but instead you have honored me by allowing me to eat at your own table. What more can I ask?" "You've said enough," David replied. "I've decided that you and Ziba will divide your land equally between you." So Ziba tells David one story and Mephibosheth tells him another story, and David's left trying to figure out who's telling the truth here. But David has neither the interest nor the energy to try to figure this thing out, because David is on a mission to reunite the nation, and he simply has no time to be sidetracked by this squabble between Mephibosheth and Ziba. And so basically David divides the property in half, and then he just moves on. The third encounter David has is with Barzillai. Now, let me remind you who he was. When David was fleeing with his people, they were tired, they were hungry, they were hanging on by a thread. They finally made it across the Jordan, and there were these three men who met them and offered them refuge, offered them food, gave them what they needed to regain their strength and to ultimately win the battle. Well, Barzillai was one of those three men, and so David wants to reward his loyalty. And he says to him, "Hey, I want you to come back with me to Jerusalem, and I'll give you everything you could ever imagine. I'll treat you just like you're a part of my family." But Barzillai says, "No, I don't want to do that. I'm 80 years old. I'm tired. I just want to go home and die. But I think my son would like to go." And so David takes his son to Jerusalem with him. And then we get to verse 40. And at this point, things start to look a lot like our politics in this country. You know, you've got this petty fighting that's going on between Israel and Judah. And basically the question is, who is going to get the more prominent position in this parade back to Jerusalem? It says, "Then the king crossed over Gilgal. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel escorted the king on his way. But all the men of Israel complained to the king, 'The men of Judah stole the king and didn't give us the honor of helping to take you, your household, and all your men across the Jordan.' The men of Judah replied, 'The king is one of our own kinsmen. Why should this make you angry? We haven't eaten any of the king's food or received any special favors.' 'But there are 10 tribes in Israel,' the others replied, 'so we have 10 times as much right to the king as you do. What right do you have to treat us with such contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing him back to be our king again?' The argument continued back and forth, and the men of Judah spoke even more harshly than the men of Israel. And so the men of Israel say, "Hey, we don't understand why Judah gets to take the lead in this parade. We were the first ones to decide to bring David back as king, and so we should have the more prominent role." And Judah's answer was, "Well, hey, we're kin, we're blood, we're family, and so we should have the more prominent role." And Israel responds, "But there are 10 tribes in us and only one in you. Therefore, we should have the place of honor, not you." And the chapter ends with a very clear statement that this nation is deeply divided. Now, what's happening in this passage? Well, what's happening is that once David gets back on his feet and gets his wits about him and realizes he's still the king and there are thousands of people expecting him to do his job, he needs to step up. And so his grand mission is to somehow reunite this nation together as one nation under God. And then the lesson I think we can learn from David, or the first lesson I think that we can learn from David probably is this, that once you know what your mission is, don't allow anything to distract you. When Shimei comes to David, David makes it clear that he's not going to engage in some personal agenda to get even with this guy. Even though that might have been tempting, you can only imagine the damage that would have created. Just additional unnecessary conflict. And so, in a wise leadership move, David granted Shimei mercy and forgiveness. David has two nephews, Abishai and Joab, who are determined to start a fight every chance they get. And once again, David stops them and he rebukes them and he says, "What's wrong with you two? You always want to start fights." And David calms them down. And then David runs into Mephibosheth and Ziba, and he's faced with the question, who's telling the truth here? Who is really on my side? There are two different stories, and David has neither the time nor the energy to get sidetracked by this domestic dispute, and so he divides the land because he's got bigger and a grander mission to attend to. And the nation of Israel was deeply divided, and David had a lot of work to do. And so what is the relevance to us today? Well, first, let's state the obvious that there are a lot of differences between Old Testament Israel and modern day America. For starters, Israel was a monarchy. Technically, it was a theocracy, which means that God was their king. But Israel was run by a monarch, a king, and a monarchy could either be good or bad. If the king was good and he said, "We're going to follow God," nobody argued with him. That's the direction the whole country took. But if the king was bad, then he just led the people away from God and everybody suffered the consequences. In this country, we don't have a king, we have a representative democracy. But here's the problem. When all of these different leaders go off in different directions because they all have different agendas, it turns into gridlock and nothing really happens. And this is not insignificant. When those who have been called to be leaders can't get along well enough to make important decisions, everybody in this country suffers the consequences. And I think this is the concern that most people have. I don't believe really that there is anyone watching today who would say, "You know what, I think everything in this country is just great. I think everything in this country is working just great." So it leaves you then with the question, what needs to happen for things to really change? And I want to offer a suggestion to you. And the suggestion is it possible that the answer to the concerns that most of us, that concerns most of us, is it possible that those answers are not found in Washington, D.C.? Is it possible that the solution is not in Washington? Is it possible that that's not where our help is going to come from, but that we need to realize that our help comes from somewhere else? Is there anybody who's watching today who thinks that we can solve the nation's problems with more laws or with more policies? Is that what's going to solve the problems that matter most to us? No. The Bible is very clear that law does not have the ability to change the human heart. The answers are not in Washington. They never have been, and they never will be. Is there anybody who's watching today who honestly thinks that the people in Washington can pass a law that will cause a white man and a black man, a Middle Eastern man and a Hispanic man to genuinely love and trust one another? Is there anybody who thinks that we can pass a law that will force someone to love your neighbor as yourself? Is there anyone who thinks that somehow out of Washington we can make up laws that create righteous people? People who are willing to make sacrifices and serve other people? And I think we're all honest enough to say, no. We recognize that the only way that's going to happen is through a radical encounter with the crucified and risen Jesus Christ. Only Jesus has the power to radically transform a human heart and genuinely, authentically bring about lasting change. And Paul told us that that's our mission. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:17, this means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone, a new life has begun. And all of this is a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. Only God has the power to change people, to get rid of the old way of thinking and the old way of living and create something new. And it begins by getting our lives right with God, being reconciled with God. And God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That means that God has given us the job of healing the divisions in our country, the divisions in our communities, the divisions in our families, and the divisions in our churches. But we've got to start by understanding that the answer is not in government. It's not in Washington. It never has been. The answer lies in the church. And it's the church's responsibility to share the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ. We can spend our lives criticizing what the people in that other party are doing. But before we get too critical about anybody in Washington, let's remind ourselves that God has called us to be the stewards of the gospel, to bring forth the message of the crucified and resurrected Christ in order to bring about true and lasting change. Now, I would guess that if I could, sit down one-on-one with each one of you today, that each Christian would agree with that, what I just said. We know that the ultimate answers don't come out of Washington. But I would suggest to you, we don't really know that. We must know that, or must not know that, because if we really understood that, and if we really believe that, then why are we so obsessed with Washington? Why are we so obsessed with politics? Why do we spend so much time investing ourselves in something that cannot bring about the lasting solution? And it seems to me that some of us must think that's where our help comes from. Or else we wouldn't spend so much time dwelling on it. I mean, why is there so much anger and strong opinions in social media if we don't think that's where the solution comes from? I mean, there are Christians who are determined to put up angry posts, take a couple of verses from the Bible and pull them out of context and say, see, God's on our side. But most of these issues are far more complicated than that. And I'm absolutely convinced that if Christians were as passionate about the gospel as they are about politics, we would see some real and lasting changes in our community. And so at some point, we've got to stop and we've got to ask ourselves, where does the answer come from? Our mission is to bring about reconciliation, and we cannot afford to get sidetracked on stuff that doesn't help to do that. And this is where we need to learn a lesson from David. Like David, we have opportunities every day to get distracted. We all run into people like Shimei, who wants to throw rocks at us, to curse us and accuse us of all sorts of things that aren't true. And the fight is always there if we want it. But we need to have the discipline and the wisdom of David to say, I've got a more important mission, and I choose not to engage in that fight because there's a bigger mission, and that has to be my focus. And sadly, there are always people like Joab and Abishai that are out there who always, they're ready to start a fight. Or if they didn't start it, they're going to make sure that they finish it. And it seems to me that some people aren't happy if they aren't involved in some level of conflict. And when Christians get in the middle of that, it makes our job in the church a lot more difficult. It distracts us from our mission of reconciliation. It makes it so much more difficult to have meaningful conversations with people about Jesus when you've got hotheads who just can't stop arguing and fighting. And then you have people like Ziba and Mephibosheth, people who are arguing with each other and you can't figure out who's telling the truth and who's not. And at some point you just have to realize, you know what? I don't have the time or the energy to figure all of this out. I'm not going to get sidetracked with this. I have a bigger, grander mission, an assignment that God has given me. You see, it's our mission to bring reconciliation to this world by bringing people to God. Our goal is to bring people to Jesus Christ so that as they submit themselves to the Lordship of Christ, it will change the way they live. It will change the way they talk. It will change the way they think. And brothers and sisters, that is the only thing that will heal the divisions in this country and bring about lasting change. Anything that we say or do that puts any kind of barrier in the way of accomplishing that mission is a step in the wrong direction. And it starts with God. The only way there's going to be true and lasting changes in this world is if there is first a reconciliation between sinful people and a holy God, made possible by the blood of Jesus Christ. It's only when people are truly reconciled to God that they have taken the first meaningful step in true reconciliation among people. This is our mission. This is our assignment.